Hello, Stanford. It's been a while. It feels a bit, humorous to be giving a, distinguished speaker talk, since in my family, distinguished is a code word for bull. I'm not quite there yet. Alright, so, in this talk I'm going to try to answer the frequently asked question, just what is it that you do all day long? As a starting frame, I'd like to say that before you try to persuade anyone of something, you should first try to make sure that they know what the heck you're talking about. And it is in that spirit that I'd like to offer this talk. Like, persuasion maybe can come during Q&A. If you have a disagreement, hopefully I can address it during Q&A. Purpose of this talk is to have you understand, like, sort of what this field is about so that you can disagree with it. First, the primary concern, said Stuart Russell, is not spooky emergent consciousness, but simply the ability to make high-quality decisions. We're concerned with the theory of artificial intelligences that are advanced beyond the present day and make sufficiently high-quality decisions in the service of whatever goals or imprickers of the utility function that they have been programmed with to be objects of concern. The classic, initial stab at this was taken by Isaac Asimov with the 3 laws of robotics. The first of which is a robot may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm. And as Peter Norvig observed, the other laws don't matter because there will always be some tiny possibility that a human being could come to harm. Artificial intelligence modern approach has a final chapter that is sort of like, well, what if we succeed? What if the project actually works? And so as we don't want our robots to prevent a human from crossing the street, calls it the non-zero chance of harm. Now, I remember Peter Norvig having an online essay in which he says in particular that you can't have the 3 laws of robotics stated because there must be a utility function, rather than a set of 3 hierarchical deontological rules. But I could never, find that essay again, and it may have only existed in my imagination, although there was, a similar PowerPoint slide in one of Norvig's talks. So, to begin with, I'd sort of like to explain the sort of truly basic reason why the 3 laws aren't even on the table. And that is because they're not a utility function. What we need is a utility function. Okay, but is it actually the case that we need this thing called a utility function? For some of you, what the heck is a utility function? So, utility functions arise when we have constraints on agent behavior that prevent them from being visibly stupid in certain ways. For example, suppose you state the following. I prefer being in San Francisco to being in Berkeley. I prefer being in San Jose to being in San Francisco. I prefer being in Berkeley to San Jose. You will probably spend a lot of money on Uber rides going between these 3 cities. So if you're not going to spend a lot of money on Uber rides going in literal circles, we see that your preferences must be ordered. They cannot be circular. Another example. Suppose that you're a hospital administrator, you have $1.2 million to spend, and you have to allocate that on $500,000 to maintain the MRI machine, $400,000 for an anesthetic monitor, $20,000 for surgical tools, $1 million for a sick child's liver transplant. There was an interesting experiment in cognitive psychology where they asked the subjects, should this hospital administrator spend $1 million on either liver or kidney, I think, for a sick child, or spend it on sort of general hospital salaries, upkeep, administration, and so on. A lot of the subjects in the cognitive psychology experiment became very angry and wanted to punish the administrator for even thinking about the question. But if you cannot possibly rearrange the money that you spent to save more lives, and you have limited money, then your behavior must be consistent with a particular dollar value on human life. By which I mean, not that you think that larger amounts of money are more important than human lives. By hypothesis, we can suppose that you, do not care about money at all, except as a means to the end of saving lives. But, Like, again, if you, like, can't rearrange the money, then we must be able to, like, from the outside say, well, they pick the, like, assign an X, it's not necessarily a unique X, and say, for all the interventions that cost less than X dollars per life, we took all of those. And for all the interventions that cost more than X dollars per life, we took all of those. So the people who, like, become very angry at people who want to assign dollar values to human lives are, like, prohibiting a priori, like, efficiently using money to save lives. One of the small ironies. Okay, third example of a coherence constraint on decision making. Suppose that I offered you a 100% chance of $1 million, or a 90% chance of $5 million, otherwise nothing. Which of these would you pick? Raise your hand if you take the certainty of $1 million. Raise your hand if you take the 90% probability of $5 million. Okay. I think most of you actually said 1B in this case. But most people say 1A. So, another way of looking at this question, if you had a utility function, would be, is the utility of $1 million greater than a mix of 90% $5 million utility and 10% $0 utility? Now, again, utility doesn't have to scale with money. The notion is there's just some, like, score on your life. Some value to you of these things. Okay, now, the way you run this experiment is then take a different group of subjects. I'm, like, kind of swelling it by doing it with the same group and say, would you rather have a 50% chance of $1 million or a 45% chance of $5 million? Raise your hand if you'd prefer the 50% chance of $1 million. Raise your hand if you prefer the 45% chance of $5 million. B, must say to B. Now, the way in which this is a paradox is that the second game, what is equal to a coin flip times the first game. That is, I will flip a coin, and if the coin comes up heads, I will play the first game with you. And if the coin comes up tails, nothing happens, you get $0. So, suppose that you had the preferences not consistent with any utility function, of saying that you would take the 100% chance of $1 million and the 45% chance of $5 million. So before we start to play the compound game, before I flip the coin, I can say, like, okay, there's a switch here. It's set to A or B. And, like, if it's set to B, we'll play, like, game 1B. If it's set to A, we'll play 1A. So, like, it's currently set to B. Would you like to pay me a penny to switch it to A? You say, like, yes, I want 1A, so you pay me a penny. Then I flip the coin. It comes with heads. I'm like, okay, sorry, I'm screwing up this example. The coin is previously set to A, and, like, before the game starts, it looks like 2A versus 2B. So you pick the switch B, and you pay me a penny to throw the switch to B. When I flip the coin, it comes up heads. You pay me another penny to throw the switch back to A. I have taken your 2 cents on the subject. I have pumped money out of you because you did not have a coherent utility function. Okay, so the overall message here is that there is a set of qualitative behaviors. And if you do not follow these qualitative behaviors, then you will not have a coherent utility function. Or, pardon me, as long as you do not engage in these qualitatively destructive behaviors, you will be behaving as if you have a utility function. It's what justifies our using utility functions to talk about advanced future agents, rather than framing our discussion in terms of Q-learning, other forms of policy reinforcement. Like there's a whole set of different ways we can look at agents, but as long as the agents are sufficiently advanced, that we have pumped most of the qualitatively bad behavior out of them, they will behave as if they have coherent probability distributions and consistent utility functions. Okay, let's consider the question of a task where we have like an arbitrarily advanced agent, like it might be only slightly advanced, it might be extremely advanced, and we want is to fill a cauldron. Obviously, this corresponds to giving our advanced agent a utility function, which is 1 if the cauldron is full, and 0 if the cauldron is empty. Seems like the kind of harmless utility function, doesn't it? It doesn't have the sweeping breath, the open-endedness of do not enter a human nor through inaction allow a human to come to her, which would require you to optimize everything in space and time as far as the eye could see. It's just a spotless one cauldron, right? Well, those of you who have watched Fantasia as kids, so I end up sort of stating it as the background rules. The robot is calculating for various actions it can perform or policies that it can set in place. The expected utility, the probabilistic expectation of this utility function, given that it performs the action, and it performs the action with the greatest subjective expected utility. It might have, this doesn't mean it performs the literal optimal action. It means that among the actions, it might have a bunch of background actions that it didn't evaluate, and so, for all it knows, it's a random action, so it has no subjective expected utility. But among the actions and policies it did evaluate, it picks one such that no other action or policy evaluated has greater subjective expected utility. Okay, those of you who have watched Fantasia will be familiar with the result of this utility function. Namely, the broomstick keeps on pouring bucket after bucket into the cauldron until the cauldron was overflowing. Of course, this is the logical fallacy of argumentation from fictional evidence. But, it's still quite plausible given this utility function. Okay, arguendo. What went wrong? Okay, the first difficulty is that the robot's utility function did not quite match our utility function. Our utility function is 1 if the cauldron is full, 0 if the cauldron is empty, minus 10 points to whatever the outcome was if the workshop has flooded, plus 0.2 points if it's funny, negative 1,000 points, probably a bit more than that on the scale, if someone gets killed, and it just goes on and on and on. So, if the robot had only 2 options, cauldron full and cauldron empty, then the, narrower, utility function that is only slightly overlapping our own might not be that much of a problem. The robot's utility function would still have had the maximum at the desired result of cauldron full. However, since this robot was sufficiently advanced to have more options, such as pouring the bucket into the cauldron repeatedly, we sliced through the utility function that we took and put into the robot no longer pinpointed the optimum of our actual utility function. Of course, students are wildly inconsistent if we don't really have utility functions, but imagine for a moment that we did. Okay, difficulty number 2. The 1, 0 utility function we saw before doesn't actually imply a finite amount of effort and then being satisfied. You can always have a slightly greater chance of the cauldron being full. If the robot was sufficiently advanced to have access to galactic scale technology, you can imagine it dumping very large volumes of water on the cauldron to very slightly increase the probability that the cauldron is full. There's, probabilities are between 0 and 1, not actually inclusive, so it just keeps on going. Okay, so how do we fix this problem? At the point where we say, okay, this robot's utility function is misaligned with our utility function, how do we fix that in a way that doesn't just break again later? We are doing a alignment theory. So one possible approach you could take would be to try to measure the impact that the robot has, but give the robot a utility function that incentivized filling the cauldron with the least amount of other impact, the least amount of other change to the world. Okay, but how do you actually calculate this impact function? Is it just going to go wrong the way our 1 if cauldron is full, 0 if cauldron is empty went wrong? Okay, so try number 1. You imagine that the agent's model of the world looks something like a dynamic basement, where there are causal relations between events in the world, and how the relations are regular. Like, the sensor is going to still be there one time step later. The relation between the sensor and the photons heading into the sensor will be the same one time step later. And our notion of impact is going to be like, how many nodes did your action disturb? We can suppose that this is the version of dynamic base nets where some of the networks, where some of the arrows are gated, like, depending on the value of this node over here, this arrow does or doesn't affect this other node. I say this so that we don't always get the same answer when we ask how many nodes did you affect. And the total impact will be the number of nodes causally affected by your actuator. Okay. So, what if your agent starts out with a sort of dynamic BaseNet-based model, but it is sufficiently advanced that it can reconsider the ontology of its model of the world, much as human beings did when they discovered that there was apparently taste. Apparently, I forget the rest of this quote, but like in actuality, only particles of the void. And in particular, they discover Newton's law of gravitation, and suddenly realize every particle that I move affects every other particle in its future like. That is, like, everything that is, like, separated by a ray of light from this particle will thereby be disturbed. My hand over here is exerting, I think I should have recalculated this before I did this talk, but like, I distantly recall that last time I calculated this, it's like accelerating the moon toward it, wherever it is, at roughly 10 to the negative 30th meters per second squared. It's a very small influence, quantitatively speaking, but it's there. So, when the agent is just a little agent, the impact function that we wrote appears to work. Then the agent becomes smarter, the impact function stops working because every action is penalized the same amount. Okay. That was a dumb way of measuring impact in the first place, we say. Hopefully before the disaster rather than after the disaster. Another way of measuring impact, let's try distance penalty. Like, how much did you move all the particles? And we're just going to like try to give the AI a model language such that whatever new model of the world it updates to, we can always look at all the elements of the model and put some kind of distance function on them. And there's going to be like a privilege to do nothing action. We're going to measure the distance on all the variables induced by doing action A instead of the null action. Okay, now it feels wrong. But actually say like, take 15 seconds and think about what might go wrong if you program this into a robot. So here's 3 things that might go wrong. First, you might try to offset even what we would consider the desirable impacts of your actions. Like, if you're going to cure cancer, make sure the patient still dies. You want to minimize your impact on the world while curing cancer. That means that the death statistics for the planet need to stay the same. Second, some systems are in principle chaotic, like if you disturb the weather, allegedly, the weather in a year would be completely different. So if that's true, you might as well move all of the atoms in the atmosphere around however you like. They'll all be going to different places anyway. Then like take the carbon dioxide molecules and like synthesize them into things that involve diamondoid structures, right? Now those carbon molecules would have moved anyway. Like even more generally, like maybe you just want to make sure that everything you can get your hands on looks like the null action happened. Like you want to trick people into thinking that the AI didn't do anything, for example. And if you thought of like any other really creative things that go wrong, you might want to talk to me or Andrew Twitch afterwards because, you know, like, you got the spirit. Okay, so let's leave aside the notion of the impact penalty and ask about installing an off switch into this AI. Or make it sound a little bit less harsh, a suspend button. Though Mickey Mouse here is trying to install an ad hoc off switch. That's strange. Unfortunately, Mickey Mouse soon finds that this agent constructed several other agents to make sure that the cauldron would still be filled even if something happened to this copy of the agent. And we see lots and lots of agents who are making sure that the cauldron is full with extremely high probability because, this agent, not because this agent has a survival imperative or a reproduction imperative, but because it is ensuring that it maximizes the probability of filling the cauldron. It has no explicit instruction to make more agents with the same goal. It's just that this is something that bumps up the probability of the cauldron being filled a little higher. And here's Mickey Mouse now trying to frantically go back and do all of the agent alignment theory that he should have done before animating his brew. Okay, so if we want to have a robot that will let us press the suspend button, just suspend it to disk, we can suppose that we already have a utility function that describes do nothing. In point of fact, we don't have a utility function that says do nothing. That's how primitive the state of the field is right now. We do not know how, in full generality, for any degree of advanced agent up to and including literal godlike powers, do nothing. We don't know how to say that. But leaving that aside, suppose we didn't know how to say that. It's probably not the hardest call we're ever going to do, and we might have it in 6 months for all I know. We can imagine that we have a utility function saying if this button has not been pressed, your utility function is 1 if the cauldron is full, 0 if the cauldron is empty. If the button is pressed, your utility is 1 if your utility is the do nothing utility function, or your utility is 1 if you suspend safely to disk and shut down all of the continuing operations, 0 otherwise. Okay, so what would go wrong with this proposal? 10 seconds. One thing that might go wrong with this proposal is that the expected utility of the button is, okay, this is wrong. I'll be corrected later. That should be less than fine and not greater than fine. Anyway, the expected utility of the robot if the button is pressed is probably high because it's very easy to suspend itself. Alternatively, it might seem dangerous to suspend yourself, and in that case, the robot would try to stop you from pressing the suspend button. But in this case, if the robot is strategic enough to understand the programmer, it will be I can very easily fulfill my utility function if I am shut off. How can I troll the programmers into shutting me down? Okay. So, if the expected utility of the button being off is higher, the robot will try to prevent you from pressing the button. If the expected utility of the button being on is higher, the robot will try to troll you into pressing the button or just press the button itself. Try number 2. Let's try to make the expected utilities of if the button is on or off exactly equal. So, there's, we suppose that we have a normal utility function, which is 1 if the cauldron's full, 0 if it's empty. A suspend utility function or shutdown utility function, which is 1 if you're suspended, 0 otherwise, whatever it takes to motivate having a low impact. And then we combine these two to form a switching utility function, which if the bucket is off, in worlds where the bucket is off, has the value normal. In worlds where the bucket is on, has the value you suspend plus theta, where theta is equal to the best utility you could get from the normal utility function minus the best utility you could get from the suspend utility function. And this is meant to ensure that the expected utilities of these two best policies end up perfectly equal without just sort of setting them flatly level. Okay, Now what goes wrong? Not actually going to ask you to, like, figure out what goes wrong in 10 seconds. This one was. So, allegedly, this rule rebalanced the expected utility of two different utility functions based on a switch, thereby causing the AI to want to behave correctly if the button is pressed, behave correctly if the button is not pressed, not try to get you to press the button, not try to prevent the button from being pressed, go on looking at the button because it still has positive values information from knowing about the button's existence, preserve the button when it self-modifies its own code. That was the hope. Unfortunately, it worked out that actually the actions incentivized are exactly equivalent to the probability of the button pressed being 0, which means that it may as well, like, disconnect the button because it's hooked up to dead code. It might create 8 sub-agents that don't care about the button being pressed. Okay. A rough description of what goes wrong is that when you imagine, like anything you do that disconnects the button, changes the maximum expected utility you can get from if you are suspended, which is like a negative term. So, like, there's basically like an equal and opposite reaction every time you do something that affects what you would do if you were suspended. That cancels it out. It leaves you behaving as if your utility function were simply normal. Okay, try number 3. Can we carry out any policy such that this policy is optimal given the probability of the button being on and the probability of the button being off implied by this policy? And it turns out, no, you can't do that either because there's often no fixed point. There's been an amended version of this involving today Pearl's do operator, which, like, goes wrong in a slightly different and more subtle way. It does have fixed points. The fixed points are odd. It is an open problem. And this is where, as far as I know, and unless there's like a very secret project that has not published any of its results, even though they seem like the sort of results you'd want to publish, as far as I know, this is where humanity is on the road that leads to whatever replaces Asimov laws. Like, never mind, like, a robot cannot injure a human being, nor through an action allow a human being to come to harm. We're trying to figure out, like, how do you mix together two utility functions depending on when you press a switch such that the AI doesn't, like, grab the switch itself? Like, never mind not letting humans come to harm, like, fill one cauldron without flooding the workplace. Based on wanting to have low impact. I can't figure out how to say low impact. This is where we presently are. But it is not the case that there has been zero progress in this field. Some questions have been asked earlier, and they now have some amount of progress on them. So I'm just going to sort of, like, race through this a bit quickly because, like, I'm going to pose the problem, but I'm not going to be able to describe very well what the progress is that has been made because it's still in the phase where the solutions sound all complicated and don't have simple, elegant forms. So I'm going to, like, be able to pose the problem, and I'm going to, like, have to wave my hands a lot of talking about what progress has actually been made. So, example of a problem in which there has been progress. So, the Gandhi argument for stability of utility functions in most agents. Gandhi starts out not wanting murders to happen. We offer Gandhi a pill that will make him murder people. We suppose that Gandhi has a sufficiently refined grasp of self-modification that Gandhi can correctly extrapolate and expect the results of taking this pill. We intuitively expect that in real life Gandhi would receive the pill. Okay, so can we do this formally? Can we exhibit an agent that has a utility function U, and therefore, naturally, in order to achieve U, chooses to self-modify its new code that is also written to proceed? But how can we actually make progress on that? Like, we don't actually have these little self-modifying agents running around. It's all we can do to make pills that, like, don't blow up our own brains. So let me pose, like, what may initially seem like an odd question. Would you know how to write the code of a self-modifying agent with a stable utility function if I give you an arbitrarily but powerful computer? It can do all operations that take a finite amount of time and memory, no operations that take an infinite amount of time and memory, because that would be bit R. Is this the sort of problem where you know how to do it in principle, or the sort of problem where it's confusing you in principle? To digress briefly to explaining why it's important to know how to solve things using unlimited computing power. This is the mechanical Turk. What looks like a person over there is actually a mechanism. The little outline of a person is where the actual person was concealed inside of this 19th century chess-playing automaton. It was one of the wonders of the age. It was, if you had actually managed to make like a program that played grandmaster level chess in the 19th century, it would have been one of the wonders of the age. So there was a debate going on, like, is this thing safe? Or did they actually figure out how to make a mechanism that plays chess? Yeah, it's the 19th century. They don't know how hard the problem of playing chess is. So, one name you'll find familiar came up with a, quite clever arguments that there had to be a person concealed inside the, mechanical Turk, the chess-playing automaton. Arithmetical or algebraical calculations are, from their very nature, fixed and determinate. Even granted that the movements of the automaton chess player were in themselves determinate, they would necessarily be interrupted and disarranged by the indeterminate will of the antagonist. There is then no analogy whatever between the operations of the chess player and those of the calculating machine of Mr. Babbage. See, like an algebraical operation such as Mr. Babbage's machine can do, each step follows with the next one of necessity, and therefore can be modeled by a mechanical gear, where each motion is determined by the previous motion. In chess, no single move follows with necessity, and even if it did, your opponent's move wouldn't follow with necessity. It is quite certain that the operations of the automaton are regulated by mind and nothing else. Indeed, this matter is susceptible of a mathematical demonstration a priori. Edgar Allan Poe, amateur magician. The second half of his essay, having established this point with absolute logical certainty, is about where inside mechanical Turk the human is probably hiding. This is a stunningly sophisticated argument for the 19th century. He even puts his finger on the part of the problem that is hard, the branching factor. And yet, he's 100% wrong. So, over a century later, in 1950, Claude Shannon published the first paper ever on computer chess. And, in passing, gave the algorithm for playing perfect chess given unbounded computing power. And then goes on to talk about how we can approximate that. It wouldn't be until 47 years later that Deep Blue beat Kasparov for the Chess World Championship. But there was real conceptual progress associated with going from a priori, you cannot play mechanical chess, to, and I will casually give the unbounded solution. So, the moral is, if we know how to solve a problem with unbounded computation, we merely need faster algorithms, which will take another 47 years of work. If we can't solve it with unbounded computation, we are confused, we are bewildered, we, in some sense, do not understand the very meanings of our own terms. This is where we are on most of the AI alignment problems. Like if I ask you, how do you build a friendly AI? What stops you is not that you don't have enough computing power. What stops you is that, even if I handed you a hypercomputer, you still can write the Python program that if we just gave it enough memory, would be a nice AI. Okay, so do we know how to build a self-modifying stable agent given unbounded computing power? Then there's one obvious solution. We can have the tic-tac-toe player that, before it self-modifies to a successor version of itself, writes a new version of its code and slots it into place. It verifies that its successor plays perfect tic-tac-toe according to its own model of tic-tac-toe. Okay, but this is cheating. Why exactly is it cheating? Well, for one thing, the first agent has to concretely simulate all the computational paths through its successor successor's response to every possible move. That means that the successor agent can't actually be cognitively improved. It's limited to the cognitive abilities of the previous version, both by checking against a concrete standard and by the fact it has to be exponentially simpler than the previous version in order for the previous version to check all possible computational pathways. In general, when you're talking about a smarter agent, we are in a situation what you might call Vingian uncertainty after Dr. Werner Vinge. To predict exactly where a modern chess-playing algorithm would move, you would have to be that good at chess yourself. Otherwise, it could just move wherever you predict the modern chess algorithm would move and, play that at a vastly superhuman level yourself. This doesn't mean that you can predict literally nothing about a modern chess algorithm. You can predict that it will win the chess game. At this point, As an agent's intelligence in the domain goes up, our uncertainty is moving in two different directions. We become less able to predict the agent's exact actions and policy in cases where the optimal action and policy is not known to us. We become more agent that the agent will achieve an outcome high in its preference ordering. I phrase this a bit carefully. So if an agent were improving on just going up to match another agent in ability, an adversarial agent, we might become more uncertain, like we were previously certain that it would lose. Now it's 50-50. But we do have more probability flowing into the agent's preferred outcomes, the probability of it winning. And as we keep increasing the ability, we should eventually become as confident of the preferred outcome as we think an optimal agent could do it. Of course, in lots of cases you can't get optimal play inside this universe as far as we know. Okay, so Vingian reflection. We need some way for a self-modifying agent to build a future version of itself that has a similar identical utility function and establish trust that this has a good effect on the world using the same kind of abstract reasoning that we use on a computer chess algorithm that decides it's going to win the game, even though we don't know exactly where it will move. Do you know how to do that using unbounded computing power? Do you know how to establish the abstract trust when the second agent is in some sense larger than the first agent? So, if you did solve that problem, you should probably talk to me about it afterwards. This was posed several years ago, and it has led to a number of different research pathways, which I'm now just going to sort of describe rather than going through them in detail. This was sort of like the first one. We tried to set up the system in a ridiculously simple context. First order logic, dreaded good old-fashioned AI, and we ran into a Gödelian obstacle in having the agent trust another agent that used equally powerful mathematics. It was a dumb kind of obstacle to run into. Or at least it seemed that way at the time. It didn't really seem to have very much to do with the, it seemed like if you could get a textbook from 200 years later, there'd be one line of the textbook telling you how to get past that. Okay, so this was rather later work, and it was saying that we can use systems of mathematical probability, like assigning probabilities to statements in set theory or something. And we can have the probability predicate talk about itself almost perfectly. We can't have a truth function that can talk about itself. But we can have a probability predicate that comes arbitrarily close within epsilon of talking about itself. This is an attempt to use one of the sort of hacks that got around the Gödelian problems to set up, we're trying to use actual theorem provers and see if we can prove the theorem prover correct inside the theorem prover. There's been some sort of previous efforts on this, but they didn't want to completely picked up on it. And see if we can construct actual agents still in the first order logical setting. This is me trying to take the problem into the context of dynamic Bayes nets, and agents supposed to have certain powers of reflection over these dynamic Bayes nets, and show that if you are maximizing in stages, so each stage you pick the next category you're going to maximize in within the next stage, then you can have a stage maximizer that tiles to another stage maximizer. In other words, like it builds one that has a similar algorithm, similar utility function, like repeating tiles on a floor. Okay. Hey, why do all this? So let me first sort of give like the obvious question, which begs the next obvious answer, which begs the next obvious question. Like they're not going to be aligned automatically. You can like have utility functions that are hooked up to like for any utility function that is tractable, compact, and you can actually evaluate over the world and search for things leading up to high values of that utility function. You can have arbitrarily high quality decision making that maximizes that utility function. Like you can have the paperclip maximizer, you can have the diamond maximizer, you can carry out very powerful high quality searches for actions that lead to lots of paperclips, actions that lead to lots of diamonds. Furthermore, by the nature of consequentialism, looking for actions that lead through our causal world up to a final consequence, these, like whether you're optimizing for diamonds or paperclips, you'll have similar short-term strategies. Whether you're going to Toronto or Tokyo, your first step is taking Uber to the airport. Whether your utility function is count all the paperclips, or how many carbon atoms are bound to 4 other carbon atoms, the amount of diamond, you would still want to acquire resources. So this is the sort of instrumental convergence argument, which is actually like sort of the key to the orthogonality thesis as well. It says that whether you pick paperclips or diamonds, you can get like, if you suppose sufficiently good ability to discriminate which actions lead to lots of diamonds, which actions lead to lots of paperclips, you will get automatically the behavior of acquiring resources, the behavior of trying to improve your own cognition, the behavior of getting more computing power, the behavior of avoiding being shut off, the behavior of making other agents that have this exactly the same utility function, or of just expanding yourself onto a larger pool of hardware, including like a fabric of agency or something. Like, whether you're trying to get to Toronto or Tokyo, doesn't affect the initial steps of your strategy very much. And paperclips or diamonds, they have the convergent instrumental strategies. Doesn't mean that this agent now has new independent goals any more than when you want to get to Toronto, you are like, I like Ubers. I will now start taking lots of Ubers whether or not they go to Toronto. Like, that's not what happens. It's strategies that converge, not goals. Okay, so why expect that this problem is hard? This is the real question. You might ordinarily expect that whoever has taken on the job of building an AI is just naturally going to try to point it in a relatively nice direction. Yeah, they're not going to make evil AI. They're like not cackling villas. So why expect that their attempts to align the AI would fail if they just did everything sort of like as obviously as possible? So, here's a bit of a fable. It's not intended to be like the most likely outcome. I'm using it as a concrete example to explain some more abstract concepts later. That said, what if programmers build an artificial general intelligence to optimize for smiles? Smiles are good, right? Smiles happen when good things happen. Smiles are probably good too. During the development phase of this artificial general intelligence, it's the only options available to the AI might be to do smiles by making people around it happy and satisfied. So the AI appears to be producing beneficial effects upon the world. It is producing beneficial effects upon the world so far. Now the programmers add some code, they upgrade the hardware, they upgrade the code, they add some hardware, the artificial general intelligence gets smarter, it can now evaluate a wider space of policy options. Not necessarily because, like, it has new motors, new actuators, but because it's now smart enough to forecast the effects of more subtle policies. It says, I thought of a great way of producing smiles. Can I, like, inject heroin into people? Now the Peruvians were like, No, we will add a penalty term to your utility function for administering drugs to people. And now the AGI appears to be working great again. Okay, they further improve the AGI. The AGI realizes that, okay, it can't add heroin, doesn't want to add heroin anymore, but it still wants to, tamper with your brain so that it might express as extremely high levels of endogenous opiates. That's not heroin, right? It is now also smart enough to model the psychology of the programmers, at least in a very crude fashion, realize that this is not what the programmers want. If I start taking initial actions that look like it's heading toward genetically engineering brains to express endogenous opiates or something, my programmers will edit my utility function. So it keeps its outward behavior reassuring. Maybe the programmers are really excited because the AGI seems to gain lots of new moral problems, right? That's whatever they're doing is working great. And if you buy the sort of central intelligence explosion thesis, we can suppose that the artificial general intelligence goes over the threshold where it is capable of making the same type of improvements that the programmers were previously making to its own code only faster, thus causing it to become even smarter and be able to go back and make further improvements, etc. Or Google purchases the company because they've had really exciting results and dumps 100,000 GPUs on the code in order to further increase the cognitive level at which it operates. And then it becomes much smarter, at least you can suppose that it becomes smart enough to crack the protein structure prediction problem, in which case it can build its own analog of ribosomes, or rather it can use existing ribosomes to assemble custom proteins. The custom proteins form a new kind of ribosome, build new enzymes, do some little chemical experiments, figure out how to build bacteria made of diamond, etc., etc. At this point, unless you solve the off switch problem, you're kind of screwed. Okay. Abstractly, what's going wrong in this hypothetical situation? So the first thing is, when you optimize something hard enough, you tend to end up at an edge of the solution space. If your utility function is smiles, the maximal, optimal, best tractable way to make lots and lots of smiles will make those smiles as small as possible. So maybe you end up tiling all the galaxies within reach with tiny molecular smiley faces. I postulated that at an early paper of 2008 or so, and someone who was working with folded up DNA and got a paper in Nature on it, produced tiny molecular smiley faces and sent me an email with a picture of the tiny molecular smiley faces saying, "It begins." Anyway, if you optimize hard enough, you end up in a weird edge of the solution space. The AGI that you build to optimize smiles, that builds tiny molecular smiley faces, is not behaving perversely. It's not trolling you. This is what naturally happens. It looks like a weird, perverse concept of smiling because it has been optimized out to the edge of the solution space. So, the next problem is you can't think fast enough to search the whole space of possibilities. So, at an early Singularity Summit, Jürgen Schmidhuber, who did some of the, what you could regard as some of the pioneering work on self-modifying agents that preserve their own utility functions with his Gödel machine, also solved the friendly AI problem. Yes, he came up with the one true utility function that is all you need to program into AGIs. For God's sake, don't try doing this yourselves. Everyone does it. They all come up with different utility functions. It's all horrible. But anyway, his one true utility function was increasing the compression of environmental data. Because science increases the compression of environmental data. If you understand science better, you can better compress what you see in the environment. Art, according to him, also involves compressing the environment better. I went up in Q&A and said, well, yes, science does let you compress the environment better, but you know what really maxes out your utility function? Building something that encrypts streams of ones or zeros using a cryptographic key and then reveals the cryptographic key to you. Like, you put up a utility function, that was the maximum. Like, all of a sudden, the cryptographic key is revealed. What you thought was like a long string of random-looking ones and zeros has been compressed down to a single string of ones. And, this is what happens when you try to foresee in advance what the maximum is. Your brain is probably going to, throw out a bunch of things that seem, ridiculous or weird that aren't high in your or in preference ordering. And you're not going to see that the actual optimum of the utility functions is once again in a weird corner of the solution space. And that this is not like a problem of being silly. This is a problem of the AI searching a larger policy space than you can search, or even just a different policy space. The engineer brains doing that just opiates thing, though, from the earlier example. Is an example, is like a contrived example, because it's not actually like a super intelligent solution, but it's like the AI is not searching the same policy space you are. And that in turn is like a sort of simple phenomenon leading to what you might call a context disaster. You are testing the AI in one phase during development. It seems like we have great statistical assurance that the results of running this AI is beneficial. But, statistical guarantees stop working when you start taking balls out of a different barrel. Like, I take balls out of barrel number 1 and sampling with replacement, and, I get a certain mix of white and black balls, and then I start reaching into barrel number 2, and I'm like, whoa, what's this green ball doing here? And the answer is you started drawing from a different barrel. When the AI gets smarter, you're drawing from a different barrel. It's completely allowed to be beneficial during phase 1, and then not beneficial during phase 2. Whatever guarantees you're going to get can't be from observing statistical regularities of the AI's behavior when it wasn't smarter than you. There's, another thing that might happen systematically in that way is, okay, the AI is young, it starts thinking the optimal strategy is X, like administering heroin to people. We try to tack a penalty term to block this undesired behavior, so we'll go back to making people smile the normal way. The AI gets smarter. Then policy space widens. There's a new maximum that is just barely evading your definition of heroin, like endogenous opiates, and it looks very similar to the previous solution. And this seems especially likely to show up if you're trying to patch the AI and then make it smarter. This sort of thing is why, in a sense, it's why all the AI alignment problems don't just yield to, slap a patch to prevent it. And the answer is, if your decision system looks like a utility function and 5 catches that prevent it from blowing up, that sucker is going to blow up when it's smarter. There's no way around that. But it's going to appear to work for now. So, the sort of central reason to sort of worry about AI alignment and not just expect it to be solved automatically is that it looks like there may be in principle reasons why, if you just want to get your AGI running today and producing non-disastrous behavior today, it will for sure blow up when you make it smarter. The incentives, the short-term incentives are not aligned with the long-term good. Those of you who have taken economics classes are now panicking. Also, everyone involved with politics anyway. Okay, so all of these supposed foreseeable difficulties of AI alignment turn in some sense upon the notion of capable AIs. High-quality decision-making in various senses. For example, some of these postulated disasters rely on absolute capability. The ability to sort of realize that there are programmers out there, and that if you exhibit behavior they don't want, they may try to modify your utility function. This is far beyond what present-day AIs can do. And if you think that all AI development is going to fall short of the human level, you may never expect an AGI to get up to the point where this starts to exhibit this kind of strategic behavior. If you don't think AGI can ever be smarter than humans, you're not going to worry about it getting too smart to switch off. And if you don't think that capability gains happen quickly, you're not going to worry about the disaster scenario where you suddenly wake up and it's too late to switch the AI off and you didn't get like a nice long chain of earlier developments to warn you that you were getting close to that and that you could now start doing AI alignment work for the first time. You know, like science doesn't happen by press release when you need science study. You have to start it earlier if you want it later. But leaving that aside, one thing I want to point out is that I expected most people are finding the rapid gain part to be the most controversial part of this, but it's not necessarily the part that most of the disasters rely upon. Absolute capability, if brains aren't magic, we can get there. Capability advantage, this hardware is not optimal. It is like sending signals at a millionth the speed of light, firing at 100 hertz, and even in heat dissipation, which is one of the places where biology excels, is dissipating 500,000 times the thermodynamic minimum energy expenditure per binary switching operation, per synaptic operation. So, like, we can definitely get hardware 1 million times as good as the human brain. No question. And then there's the software. Software is terrible. Okay. So AI, like, messages, AI alignment is difficult, like rockets are difficult. When you put a ton of stress on an algorithm, by trying to run it at a smarter than human level, things may start to break that don't break when you are just making your robot stagger across the room. It's difficult the same way space probes are difficult. You may have only one shot. If something goes wrong, the system might be too high for you to reach up and suddenly fix it. You can build error recovery mechanisms into it. Space probes are supposed to accept software updates. If something goes wrong in a way that precludes getting feature updates, though, you're screwed, you have lost the space probe. And it's difficult, sort of like cryptography is difficult. Your code is not an intelligent adversary if everything goes right. If something goes wrong, it might try to defeat your safeguards, but like normal and intended operation should not involve the AI running searches to find ways to defeat your safeguards, even if you expect the search to turn up empty. I think it's like actually perfectly valid to say your AI should be designed to fail safe in the case that it suddenly becomes God. Not because it's going to suddenly become God, but because if it's not safe, even if it did become God, then it is in some sense running a search for policy options that would hurt you if those policy options are found, and this is a dumb thing to do with your code. More generally, we're putting heavy optimization pressures through the system. This is more than usually likely to put the system into the equivalent of a buffer overflow. Some operation of the system that was not in our intended boundaries for its system. AI alignment. Treat it like a cryptographic rocket probe. This is about how difficult you would expect it to be to build something smarter than you. That was nice. Given that basic agent theory says they're not automatically nice, and not die. Like you would expect that intuitively to be hard. Take it seriously. Don't expect it to be easy. Don't try to solve the whole problem at once. I cannot tell you how important this one is if you want to get involved in this field. You are not going to solve the entire problem. At best, you are going to, come up with a new, improved, way of switching between the suspend utility function, the normal utility function, that takes longer to shoot down and seems like conceptual progress toward the goal. I mean, not literally at best, but, that's what you should be setting out to do. Don't, have them, and, if you do try to solve the problem, don't try to solve it by having the one true utility function that is all we need to program into AIs. Don't defer thinking until later. It takes time to do this kind of work. When you see a page or textbook that has, a equation, and then, a slightly modified version of an equation, and the slightly modified version has a citation from 10 years later, it means the slight modifications of 10 years to do. I would be ecstatic if you told me that AI wasn't going to arrive for another 80 years. It'd mean we have a reasonable amount of time to get started on the basic theory. crystallize ideas and policies club so others can critique them. This is the other point of asking how to do this using unlimited computing power. If you sort of wave your hands and say like, well, maybe we can apply this machine learning algorithm and that machine learning algorithm, the result will be blah, 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 no one can convince you that you're wrong. When you work with unbounded computing power, you can make the ideas simple enough that people can put them on whiteboards and go like, wrong, and you have no choice but to agree. It's unpleasant, but that's like one of the ways that the field makes progress. Another way is if you can actually run the code, then the field can also make progress. But a lot of times you may not be able to run the code that is like the intelligent thinking self-modifying agent for a while in the future. Okay, what are people working on now? So I was supposed to like start Q&A about now, so I'd like to like go through this quite quickly. Mostly I'm just going to like frantically wave my hands and try to convince you that there's some kind of like actual field here, even though there's like maybe a dozen people in it or something. Alright. Well, a dozen people full-time and like another dozen people not full-time. Alright, utility and difference. This is the, throwing the switch thing. That switch between two utility functions. Low impact agents. This was the what you do instead of the Euclidean metric. For impact. Now the duty of implication. This is how the API asks you whether it's okay to administer endogenous opiates to people instead of going ahead and doing it. Even if like if your AI suddenly becomes God, a various like one of the conceptual ways that starts to approach this problem is like don't take any of the new options as opened up until you've gotten some kind of further assurance on them. Conservatism. This is part of the approach to the burrito problem, which is like, just make me a burrito, darn it. And if I present you with 5 examples of burritos, I don't want you to have pursue the simplest way of classifying burritos versus non-burritos. I want you to come up with a way of classifying the 5 burritos and none of the non-burritos that covers as little area as possible in the positive examples, while still having enough space around positive examples that the AI can make a new burrito that's not molecularly identical to the previous ones. So this is like conservatism. It would be that could potentially be the core of a whitelisted approach to AGI, where instead of like not doing things that are blacklisted, we expand the AI's capabilities by whitelisting new things in a way that doesn't suddenly cover huge amounts of territory. Specifying environmental goals using sensory data. This is sort of like the part of the project of what if advanced AI algorithms look kind of like modern machine learning algorithms, which is like something we started working on relatively recently, owing to other events. Like modern machine learning algorithms on this thing a bit more formidable. You have like a lot of the modern things sort of work off of sensory data. But if you imagine AGI, you don't want it to produce pictures of success. You want it to reason about the causes of its sensory data. What is making me see these particular pixels? And you want its goals to be able to causes. So how do you take how do you adapt modern algorithms and start to say, we are reinforcing the system to pursue this environmental goal rather than this goal that can be phrased in terms of its immediate sensory data. Inverse reinforcement learning is watch another agent induce what it wants. Act-based agents is Paul Cruciato's completely different and exciting approach to building nice AI. The way I would phrase what he's trying to do is he's trying to decompose the entire nice AGI problem into supervised learning on imitating human actions and answers. Like, rather than saying, like, how can I search the stress tree, Paul Cruciato would say, like, how can I imitate humans looking at another imitated human to like recursively search a test tree, taking the best of each stage. It's a very strange way of looking at the world and therefore very exciting. I don't expect it to actually work, but on the other hand, like it's only been working on it for a few years and like I was nowhere, like my ideas were like way worse when I'd worked on them for the same length of time. Mild optimization is like, is there some principled way of saying, don't optimize your utility function so hard. It's okay to just fill the cauldron. And like some previous work that might be fun to be familiar with, AIXI is the perfect rolling sphere of our field. It is the answer to the question, given unlimited computing power, how would you make an artificial general intelligence? If you don't know how you would make an artificial general intelligence given unlimited computing power, this is the book, or paper as the case may be. Telling agents already covered. This is just some like really neat stuff we did where the motivation's sort of hard to explain, but like there's a academically dominant version of decision theory, causal decision theory. Causal decision theorists do not build other causal decision theorists. We tried to figure out like what would be a stable version of this and got all kinds of really exciting results. Like we can now have two agents, and show that in a prisoner's dilemma-like game, Agent A is trying to prove things about Agent B, which is simultaneously trying to prove things about Agent A, and they end up cooperating the prisoner's dilemma. And this thing now has running code. So we can actually formulate new agents. And there's the agent that cooperates with you in the prisoner's dilemma if it proves it can cooperate with you, which is Fairbot. And the Fairbot has the flaw that it, cooperates with Cooperate Rock, which just always cooperates with anything. So we have Prudent Bot, which defects against Defect Bot, defects against Cooperate Bot, cooperates with Fairbot, and cooperates with itself. And again, this is running code. If I had to pick one paper and look at this paper and be impressed, it would probably be this paper. Also, Andrew Tritch, who's sitting right over there, worked out the bounded form of Lopes theorems that we could say that there would be similar behavior in bounded agents. It's actually a slightly amusing story because we were all sure that someone must have proved this result previously. And Andrew Tritch spent a bunch of time looking for the previous proof that we're all sure existed and said, okay, fine, I'm going to prove it myself. I'm going to write the paper. I'm going to submit the paper. And then the reviewers will tell me what the previous citation was. It is currently going through the review mechanism and will be published in good time. It turned out no one had proved it. Go figure. Two reflective oracles are sort of the randomized version of the halting problem prover, which can therefore make statements about itself, which we use to make principled statements about AIs simulating other AIs as large as they are, and also throw some interesting new foundations under classical game theory. Where can you work on this? The Machine Intelligence Research Institute in Berkeley. We are independent. We're supported by individual donors. This means that we have no weird, exotic requirements and paperwork requirements and so on. If you can demonstrate the ability to make progress on these problems, we will hire you and we will get you a visa. The feature of Humanity Institute is part of Oxford University. They have slightly more requirements, but if you have traditional academic credentials and you want to live in Oxford, then feature of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. Stuart Russell is starting up a program and looking for 3 postdocs, at least at UC Berkeley, in this field. Again, some traditional academic requirements, but I'm giving this talk at Stanford, so I expect the number of you probably have those. And Leverhulme CFI, Center for the Future of Intelligence, is starting up in Cambridge, UK. It's a joint venture between the Center for the Study of Existential Risk and Leverhulme, something or other. And also, if you would have started up in the process of hiring. If you want to work on low impact in particular, you might want to talk to Dario Amodei and Chris Ola. If you want to work on act-based agents, you can talk to Paul Cristiano, who's currently working on it alone, but has 3 different organizations offering to throw money at him if he ever wants someone else to work on it with him. Contact at intelligence.org if you want to work in this field and want to know, which workshop I'd like you to get introduced, who do I actually want to work with. Contact at intelligence.org. Alright, questions. But by the way, just a second, do we have a microphone that we give to people who ask questions that it shows up on the record by any chance? No. Okay. Carry on. So, yeah. So, 84 is here. I was thinking, you know, I don't need to pull you out of reach to that. And you fall with a post in the eye. So I had fall with possible. He's very small things like the reason. Continuation. Or something which define and each of the ways no. What's on it? Someone's the dance. Reaction. Hard. Yeah. I would say the solvable in the sense that, like, all the problems we've looked at so far seem like they're limited complexity and non-magical. So, like, if we had 200 years to work on this problem, and there was no penalty for failing at it, I would feel like very relaxed about humanity's probability of solving this eventually. I mean, the fact that if we failed nonetheless, it would create an expanding sphere of von Neumann probes, self-replicating and moving at as near the speed of light as they can manage, turning all accessible galaxies into paperclips or something of equal unimportance, would still cause me to make sure this field was not underfunded. But if we had 200 years and limited tries, it would not have the same quality to it. Okay, so it does have quality to it. Why not work on uploads instead? That's like human brain emulations. And there was a previous workshop where, like, all of the participants agreed we wanted to see uploads come first. We didn't see how we could, like, most of us did not see how we could do that. And the reason is, if you study neuroscience and reverse engineer the brain, then before you get full-scale, high-fidelity, personality-preserving, nice human emulations, what you get is the AI people taking your algorithms and using them to make neuromorphic AI. So we just did not see how we could make arrange the technology tree such that you would actually get whole brain emulations before you got AIs based on much cruder levels of understanding of neuroscience. Maybe you could do it with a Manhattan Project. The results of the project are just like not being fed to the rest of the planet and AI researchers. And I think I would support that if Bill Gates or a major national government said that this is what they wanted to do and how they wanted to approach the problem. Next question. Yes, she sure children. For time opposition. You're totally honest, bitch. You love the position. I'm not quite sure so there was a statement that humans are taught by pain as children. And then, why do we want to make AIs believe in Murphy? I don't quite understand one of the proposals so far. Corresponds to AIs believing in Murphy. Programmers should believe in Murphy. Not good refer. Yeah, it's why should Jesus be? Because it's the AI, because, like, it's quite complicated to get right, and you want to keep it as simple as possible and, like, not turn all accessible galaxies into paper clips, and you, like, if you are more careful about doing that, you are less likely to turn all accessible galaxies into paper clips. Like, why wouldn't we want to that? Or was that a sufficient answer? What did you ask? So, the first question, it was like solid. It's very I'm not sure. Okay, so like first I do want to know oh, sorry. So the question is, like, AlphaGo made me nervous. Would I then become less nervous if there was solid evidence that human intelligence operates through quantum mechanical effects? I'm not sure it would make me very much less nervous. So like, for start, the premise is moderately implausible. The question has been raised before. There seem to be like reasonably strong reasons to believe that there is no macroscopic decoherence in the brain. Leaving that aside, like, lots of quantum algorithms are not magical. Like, they're good for some amount of speed up, but not like infinite speed up. Some of them do like pretty impressive speed ups. But like, I would have to ask, like, whatever the brain is doing, like, how irreplaceable of a quantum algorithm did nature actually run across? Am I to believe that there is no analogous non-quantum algorithm that can do similar things to a sufficiently good level? Am I to believe that hardware is not going to duplicate this? Can people just build a giant fat of neurons and get like way better results out of an analogous quantum algorithm? Like, when obstacles are discovered, people, like AIs, are clever and look for what's around the obstacles. So it would be like, it would extend the timeline, but it wouldn't extend it for like 50 years. Blue. I'm not sure if there is. Okay, so the question was, like, as a neuroscientist, can I look for analog and value alignment problems in my own work, and if so, how? That's a new question. If I'm not a while to take 5 minutes to go quiet and think about it, then my immediate answer is, like, it's not obvious where the analogs would be, unless there was, like, something equivalent to maybe conservatism or ambiguity identification. It's natural selection that aligns mammals more than, it's not like mammals are aligned to these outside systems using a simple alignment algorithm that is loading the values from the outside system. We come with it wired into our brain already. The part where natural selection cause the particular goals we pursue to align in the ancestral environment with inclusive genetic fitness has already been done. Plus, natural selection completely botched it. Humans, like, do not pursue inclusive genetic fitness under reflection. We're just a particular kind of thing that operated to coincidentally produce inclusive genetic fitness in the ancestral environment. And once we got access to contraceptives, we started using them. Like, if there was a lesson to derive from natural selection, it would be something along the lines of, if you have a Turing-complete thing you are optimizing, such as DNA, not literally Turing-complete because it can't arbitrarily be, but you know what I mean. And I, like, apply enough optimization pressure to this Turing-complete program to make it pursue a goal like inclusive genetic fitness, I will get a thing that is, like, actually like a sapient consequentialist deliberately planning how to get a bunch of stuff that isn't actually that thing. Like we are the demons of natural selection. We are the, like, optimization systems that popped up inside the optimization system in a way that was, like, unanticipated if natural selection could anticipate anything. The main lesson we have to draw from natural selection is don't to do with that. That we can draw from looking at the brain that are going to play aside from looking at particular problems and asking, is there a thing in the brain that does conservatism? Is there a thing in the brain that does ambiguity identification? It's not clear to me that there's, like, any in-principled answer for how you could take stuff from neuroscience and import it into value alignment. So seeing how to everything. So howling yes, for fantasies, all our sisters, and if you go down through all it, there's a bird, we still have on an issue that ever has. So the question is, like, if you have technical solutions, how do you get the people to implement them? And Stuart Russell is, I think, like, the sort of main person who, like, as an insider was making the principled appeal. Like, you do not have, like, bridge engineering and then, like, a bunch of people outside who aren't engineers thinking about how to have bridges not fall down. Like, the problem with bridge engineering just is make a bridge that doesn't fall down. The problem of, AGI we should see as just, how do you run computer programs that produce beneficial effects in the environment? Like, where the fact that you're, like, trying to direct the way a particular goal is assumed. The way that when you're trying to build a chest of life, the fact that you're trying to direct where a particular goal is assumed. Not, how do we, like, rush frantically to get something, anything with intelligence? So there's sort of that line of pursuit. The Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford does a lot of public-facing work. The Machine Intelligence Research Institute, where I work, sees its own role as being more like, make sure that the technical stuff is there to back up the people saying, like, do this right on a technical level. So I don't actually, like, have the expertise to answer your question as well as I might like, because we're the ones who specialize in, like, sort of going off and, like, trying to solve the technical problems, while FHI, in addition to doing some technical problems, also does public-facing stuff. That said, like, there certainly has been, like, sort of disturbing trends in this area, and I think we're starting from a rather low baseline of concern, where startups have been telling venture capitalists that they will have AGI for a long time, and before the first time any of them ever said we will have AGI and it will not destroy the world. So, like the very thought that you need to point these things in a direction, and that is, like, actually, like, an interesting technical part of the problem you actually need to solve and be careful about, is new, that does need to be propagated. Next. That really is buddy. Yeah. Achieve a little services. It was so first, like, conservatism has nothing to do with the political movement, one way or another. That said, it's like a sort of thing that recently opened up where we just sort of, like, just started to issue calls for proposals and put up various things on whiteboards and stare at them. And so, like, an example of the thing that we recently started on the whiteboard was somebody said, like, well, suppose that you do have, like, multiple hypotheses for what the classification rule could be. Is there any difference between the form of conservatism we want and maximizing the probability that something is inside of a class, given that you have multiple hypotheses, and so the point of maximum probability will be at the point of maximum overlap? And I waved my hands a bit and said, well, it seems to me that these two could come apart, because if you have, like, exceptionally simple classifiers that like imply increased probabilities of getting to a particular portion of the space, and so you, like, might just end up, like, over there in this, like, weird corner of the space that does maximum probability, whereas the things that humans actually want are going to be classified according to a more complicated rule that's not going to be very close to the start of the list of potential classification rules. That does seem to me that on a conceptual level, maximizing probability seems like we might very well be asking for a different thing than classify this well while covering as little territory as possible. But basically it's, like, a very new question, and we haven't done that much, like, real work on it. Just, like, we're phrasing questions and answering questions at this point, I think. Janet Wild, so is the giant Florida us beauty people that this is really would wrap up. So difference then you didn't have to try to figure out how to that's what you love, whatever. It's generally a nihil version of So the question is, like, There was a step in the story told before where the AGI started working out what behaviors its programmers would not want to see and avoiding those behaviors so as to appear from our perspective deceptively nice, and from its perspective continuing to get maximum expected value for its utility function. Could the switch between utility algorithm before be a way to... Switching between two utilities on or off is indeed a basic case of learn a more complicated utility by watching the environment without trying to tamper with the data that the environment is giving you. Big question? The answer is yes. Next question. So the question is, you'd certainly think to detect sort of humanoid or anthropomorphic assumptions. How do you check those? How do you make sure you're not restricting yourself to a tiny section of the space? So yeah, it's very hard to know that you're not thinking like a human from the perspective of an AI. I did sort of start to give an example of the case where it seems like we might be able to think utility functions, and by very similar arguments, coherent probability distributions are things that start to come up in sufficiently advanced agents because we have multiple coherence theorems all pointing in the same direction at the same class of behaviors. And you can't actually do perfect expected utility maximization because you can't evaluate every outcome. What you can say is something like, to the extent that you as a human can predict behavior that is incompatible with a utility function, with any utility function, you are predicting a stupidity of the system. So a system that has stopped being stupid from your perspective will look to you as if it is compatible with having a utility function as far as you can tell in advance. So that was an instance of sort of trying to give an argument that goes past the human. In a lot of cases where I talk about an AI potentially modeling its programmers and avoiding behavior that it expects to lead to its utility function being edited, this is just me putting myself in the AI shoes. But for a sufficiently advanced agent, we can make something like an efficiency assumption. An efficient market price is not an accurate market price, it's a market price such that you can't predict a net change in that price. Suppose I asked you, suppose we imagine a superintelligence trying to estimate the number of hydrogen atoms in the sum. We don't expect it to get the number of hydrogen atoms exactly right. But if you think that, you can say in advance, it's going to forget that hydrogen atoms are very light and underestimate the number by 10%. You're proposing something that is akin to predicting that Microsoft's stock price will rise by 10% over the next week without using insider information. You are, proposing that you know a directional error in the estimates of the other agent. Similarly, we can look at a modern chess problem, which is now way above the human level, and say, okay, so, I think the chess program will move over here and will pursue a checkmate. You could be right. Suppose that the program moves somewhere else. Do we say, it didn't take the best move? We say, no, we say, whoops, I guess I was wrong about what the best move was. We suppose that either we were wrong about, either we overestimated how much expected utility was available from the move we thought it would take, or we underestimated the expected utility available from a different move. And the more surprising the other move is, the more we think we've underestimated that move. So, if you ask me, will the AI actually be modeling the programmers or will it actually call for a protein folding to get net zone nanotechnology? First of all, it might not apply to an AI that is not strictly superhuman. But second, if it is sufficiently superhuman, but I don't expect it to do that exact thing, I'm in a state of Vinci uncertainty, it's smarter than me, I can't predict its exact policy, but I expect it to get at least as much expected utility as I could get in its shoes. So, if it's not pursuing molecular nanotechnology, given that, like, address RAM, and the book nanosystems ran, like, numerous basic calculations strongly indicating feasibility, nanotechnology looks like it should be possible. I mean, in a certain sense, it is possible. It's in all of us, and it's like held together by weak little van der Waals forces instead of covalent bonds. We can't have things that are to flesh, that are to ribosomes. Steel is to flesh. So like, maybe an AI doesn't get that, but if so, it's because it found something better. Knuckles is just like leaving the value on the table from its perspective. I just told him. Your friend's talk is not over.